This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia is from Texas, but before she was a member of Congress, she was a judge who for years played a very important role in Houston courtrooms. It's easy to forget that less than 3 years ago, Donald Trump withheld weapons from the president of Ukraine, who was worried about defending his country against Russia, in order to pressure Ukraine to get involved in the U.S. election, to insert itself in our media landscape by accusing Hunter Biden of corruption. President Trump essentially said to President Zelensky, "Unless you help me win the election, I won't give you the equipment you need to defend yourself." Of course, if he was really so worried about American corruption in Ukraine, he could have taken this up with Rudy Giuliani and Paul Manafort, but I digress. The point is, after Trump did this, members of Congress who had been thinking about impeachment for a long time finally made up their minds and said, now's the time. If we don't impeach him now, what standards will be left for the presidency? Will future presidents have any obligation to protect national security at all? When this happened, the Democrats tapped Congresswoman Garcia to actually stand in the Senate and do the work the Constitution requires in cases of impeachment to make the case before the Senate that what the president did warranted removal. Today, with unspeakable suffering happening in Ukraine, we reflected on what that time in history was like with Congresswoman Garcia and also talked about much more. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with real audience questions. For information on how to join us and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever podcast streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Wednesday featuring Congressman Tony Gonzalez, who's also from Texas, about immigration. Our co-founders Justin Higgins and John Gunnison led the interview. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
You've had this long career in public service, and you went up almost every step of the way. You served at the county level, at the city level, at the state level, and then in the U.S. Congress. Across your long career in public service, did you ever expect that you would be so directly involved in the impeachment of a president of the United States?
Well, absolutely not. I mean, even after being sworn in as a member of Congress, I never would have imagined that I would have been in that role. You know, obviously as a lawyer and someone who's a former judge, I'd read about impeachments. I know what the Constitution says. I know even the judges can be impeached. But that is not something that ever had entered my mind and frankly, never did until Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker herself, asked me. She kind of, after a meeting that we had with her about another topic, I think it was dealing with some unaccompanied minors issues related to some detention centers. It was a meeting with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And after the meeting, she left her seat and came to me and just said something like, "Well, you haven't asked me about wanting to be an impeachment manager or asked me anything about that." And I said, "No, I trust your judgment. There's over 200 Democrats that you can pick from. I'm sure you'll pick the right person." And she says, "Well, what do you think I should do?" And I said, "Well, I think we need to look at what the case needs to be and then pick members that can help do that." I said, because this is very different than what I think of as a real trial. This seems to be more in the nature of appellate argument. So it would be someone who really is good and comfortable in the setting, someone who can make an argument and can really be persuasive versus, like a hotshot trial lawyer, because there's not going to be like a real trial with witnesses and things. I said, you got to pick the right team for what we're going to try to be doing. And she said, interesting. She said, so do you feel comfortable? I said, yeah, well, I've been a judge. I've been a lawyer. I said, I feel comfortable walking into any courtroom. But of course, the United States Senate is not a courtroom. In fact, when we first walked on there, I just felt this awesome responsibility that, frankly, I just kind of stood there when we marched over there to present the articles of impeachment to the Senate. And I just thought, I just can't believe this. I am here, to make a case to impeach the president of the United States. It was kind of like one of those, well, holy Meloni, I'm here. So it's not anything that I saw. It's not anything that I ever thought of doing. The speaker asked me, and when she called me, I guess almost a week later, that she wanted me to serve, I just simply said, "Madam Speaker, If this is something you want me to do, of course, I will do it.
You mentioned Speaker Pelosi going through basically how she was deciding to choose the members, and you mentioned the merits of the case. And I wanted to try and set the timeline here. So in April of 2019, the Mueller report came out. And before the Mueller report came out, there was pressure building by some in your caucus to begin impeachment proceedings for various things. And in March, right before the Mueller report dropped, Nancy Pelosi was quoted as saying, quote, "Unless there's something so compelling and so overwhelming and bipartisan, I don't think we should go down that path because it divides the country." And she added, "He's just not worth it," of Trump. So I'm guessing, considering you were an impeachment manager, from your perspective, what made Trump's extortion of Zelensky so much more compelling than his other transgressions of campaign finance, of not being willing to divest from his businesses despite being president of the United States, and also obstruction of justice, which Mueller would eventually outline in his report? Why was Zelensky's call so different that he needed to be impeached?
Well, because it was in his own words. I mean, there was a tape. I mean, there was, in my view, clear and convincing evidence. And, when Zelensky said, and I forget the exact words, that they needed, help, especially with their military defenses, and that they needed some javelins. And then the president's response is, "But I need a favor, though." That to me was like the crux of the matter, that he was wanted a quid pro quo. He was saying, "I'll do that for you, but you've got to do this for me." And what he wanted done for him was not anything that was in behalf and for the protection and for affirming his oath of office and his obedience to the United States of America. It was something for him, something for his politics, someone that was a personal favor. So that's what made it so different. And I think that's when a lot of the public, I mean, I don't know if you remember that everything just kind of shifted, like, oh my God, there it is. Because when you read, I read the Mueller report. I mean, I read it in preparation for the trial. And if you read it, you kind of really had to keep track of all the characters. You had to keep track of who was doing what. So, and then he never really gave us a solid finding. There was some things there that we could really work with, but the phone call, his own words, the transcript, that's clear and convincing. So I think that's what made the big difference. And when you look at the former twice impeached president, in my view, he did all those three. And for him, it was all of the above, because he really, really never seemed to be focused on the good of the people and the good of our democracy and the good of the United States of America, and the trust that we put in him being elected. And I'm not saying because I obviously didn't vote for him, but in terms of Americans, I mean, he won the election. He was handed a trust, and he betrayed that public trust. And he seemed to be focused on doing that, in my view, almost every day. Every tweet was another eye-opener. So I think that really made a difference, is hearing it in his own words, seeing the transcript, and seeing it right before you in real time.
I would bet everything, whatever the president said, was in the best interest of our country.
A whistleblower complaint is hearsay here. The whistleblower was not on the phone call.
This guy wasn't on the call. Someone else told him about the call.
Why did they pick this whistleblower to tell a hearsay story?
A lot of these accusations have turned out to not be true.
It looks to me like another deep state attack.
Salem witch trials have more due process than this.
They still are not providing the same kind of basic due process rights.
Secret interviews, selective leaks.
Is that appropriate to ask for a foreign government to interfere in the election?
I don't imagine that's what he was doing.
President Zelensky didn't do the statement. He didn't go out and make a statement. He's committed to no specific type of investigation, so there's been no linkage whatsoever.
Quid pro quo here.
The quid pro quo, in my judgment,
is a red herring.
I appreciate that we have a president who's very transparent about his opinions.
Well, I think it's perfectly appropriate to ask a foreign leader to look into potential corruption.
Did you initially think that you were going to get some bipartisan support out of the Republicans in the House when the eventual impeachment was voted on? Or did you know from day one it's a non-starter? They're never going to view this impartially?
Well, I'm one of those people that truly believes on listening to both sides and looking at the facts and then making a judgment. I don't think I got to the point where I was ready to proceed with impeachment until the full investigation, after we got the Mueller report, after we heard from all the witnesses. We heard from the former ambassador to Ukraine, the one that Trump fired. We heard from, people who were there because it was so compelling to hear from them and how he just obstructed and put barriers to anything that they were doing because he just seemed to be, in a completely opposite direction that you frankly wondered just whose interest he really was favoring. When you see now what's erupted in Ukraine, you kind of like begin to finally kind of like, okay, well, now we understand why he was such a good friend and always seemed to be saying such glowing things about, Putin. And he still does to this day. He said Putin was a genius the way he attacked Ukraine. And you have to wonder, when he said, yes, I know you need this, but I need a favor though. I mean, whose interest was he really protecting? Was it just his own personal interest or was there somebody else in the room?
What were the most compelling pieces of evidence regarding Trump's abuse of power charge, Article 1 in the impeachment files? What did you hear that you were like, okay, this is concrete, this is ironclad, this is what will convince the public in the Senate?
Well, as I said before, the telephone call for sure, because it was in his own words while he reported. We had a copy. People could see that in real time. I found Vindman's testimony very, very compelling. In fact, I think he was one of the most persuasive witnesses. But keep in mind that I didn't get to ask him questions. The impeachment managers didn't ask him questions. We were not allowed to call any witnesses. We weren't allowed to do any depositions. All we had was video of the testimony that they had presented to the Intelligence Committee, but not the Judiciary Committee. We had only had a number of constitutional experts so we could talk about the legal analysis and the legal backdrop. Because, in my mind, the setup of a trial was not what the ordinary American would expect of a trial. I think I said in some of my remarks, I forget if it was the first day or the second day, I used to train judges and I would tell them, the first thing you've got to remember is that everybody deserves their day in court and everybody deserves their opportunity to cross-examine witnesses. That is not happening here. But yet the 100 senators were acting as jurors. So already the deck was a little stacked against us, and we knew that coming in. So it was a strong case, and we were hopeful. We were hopeful that Romney and Collins, I think there was about 2 or 3 that we still thought from the Senate that we could convince. In the end, only Senator Romney and only in one of the articles, stood with us. But I think if we were to poll the American people, they saw through it all. And that's the bottom line. He has done so much that has been against the interests of our country and continues to do that. I mean, speaking now about Hunter Biden and speaking so favorably of a war criminal, I'll agree with the president. The man is a thug. And to see a former president seem to side with that thug rather than what our country is trying to do for saving a democracy is just incredible. It's totally incredible.
Congresswoman, you talked about how strange this process was and how different it was from a normal courtroom. It is very unusual that one of the jurors would be a witness, Ron Johnson. It's hard to imagine another legal setting where someone could be both a witness to the events concerned and then serve on the jury. But let's talk about how you constructed the case as you presented them, the case to this jury, such as it was. We talked about assembling the team and what you brought to the team and what some of the other impeachment managers brought to the team. Could you tell us a little bit about how you divided the sections of the case that you were going to make to the Senate? How do you decide what topics would be assigned to which managers as you presented the case?
Well, first of all those decisions really were handled. I mean, we met every morning, as part of our preparation. We met every morning during the entire trial. Sometimes we'd meet after to just kind of debrief and see if we needed to change anything. But it really was like a real trial. If you've ever been around a trial lawyer, it's intense. There's a lot of reading. There's very little sleep, maybe some eating. But the key was always to stay hydrated. And the decisions and the work, and we trusted him implicitly, and I still do to this day, and we're left up to our lead impeachment manager, and of course that's Adam Schiff. And he and our counsel, and together with the staff, would go through, what we needed to accomplish the next day, and we'd sit around and decide if that was the strategy. There'd be some input, and then we'd look at everybody's skill sets. They tended to give me items that were about evidence, about sort of courtroom stuff, and about I got a lot of the Hunter Biden issues because it was all in the nature of oral arguments. Val Demings, because of her background as a sheriff and law enforcement, she got a lot of the pieces of the case that had to do about enforcement, that had to do about holding up to duty and honor. Jason Crow, because he was the veteran, he got all the assignments that had to do more with Ukraine and its strengths and the military positioning and why they needed this and the background of all that. And Hakeem Jeffries, he's just the orator. You can give him almost any assignment, but he always stepped up and was kind of like sometimes like the closer, but right before Adam Schiff, who was always the one who kind of laid the groundwork together with Mr. Nadler, who was, of course, the chair of Judiciary. So everybody had their strengths and kind of like their background. That we really did prepare that way and had everything divided up by topic. My trial notebook had tabs on probably about 20 or 30 potential topics every day that I had to be ready for in case they came up. So we were all at the table, and when there was a topic that came up, if it was yours in your tab, then you were the one who got up. But before you did, we kind of always, and I don't know if you ever watched this, but we kind of would all lean in and just go, okay, that's Sylvia's. And then I would get up and do the response. And one time I remember that we leaned in, and it was an issue about Hunter Biden, and Val said, well, it's part of mine because of this. And I said, well, it's part of mine because of this. And she said, it's okay, I'll take it. So she got up. There was one time that the topic was really also Adam Schiff's and Nadler's, and they both kind of got up, and we had to quickly decide, no, let's let Adam do it. So everybody had their trial notebook. We had our topics. We'd done our briefings. We'd been, stayed up night reviewing our notes. So we always kind of knew who would be doing what. And like the Congress in all our committee hearings, we had our scripts, we had our notes. And those of us who are lawyers, like I had like a trial notebook like I'm accustomed to.
So regarding that preparation, Congresswoman, When you were crafting these different arguments or your 25 to 30 tabs for the day, how much of that process was focused on persuading individual GOP senators, so the jurors, maybe instead of persuading the senators, persuading their constituents to provide some political pressure, or if you were at a point where you didn't think there was going to be anything to flip, how much of this was just trying to outline a clear argument for the historical record and future generations that would dig into this impeachment?
First and foremost was making sure we had a clear argument, and we were reminded every day, and we reminded ourselves every day that we were talking to the American people, that was the real audience. However, just in terms of numbers, it's just like any other trial. You look at your jury, you know the makeup, you know who you need to persuade, because remember, in a jury, you get a little sheet on every juror, and you know their background, and you know you've had an opportunity to either strike them and keep them on the jury or not, but then you've got the group and you know who's what. And like, I always knew that it was important kind of look straight to sort of like middle left, because that's where Susan Collins and a couple of members that we thought maybe would be listening and maybe really would be open to voting for us. And then I would really have to look way to the left, because I knew that's where Mr. Romney sits. So that's what I did. I don't know if all the other members did, but I knew who might be open to it. And there was times when I would, directly look at in their direction to make sure that they would hear what I was saying. And I remember that particularly one, because I know that the Mr. Romney is very man of faith, as I am, and I had made some arguments, and I had quoted something from the Bible. And then when I did that, I purposely, kind of looked his direction, because I was hopeful that he would listen and that he would be persuaded. And I don't know if it worked or not. But again, it's part of what you're learned as a lawyer to do and as a presenter, is to know your audience and to, try to connect with them. And that's what I try to do. And I think most of us did that in some form or fashion.
Congresswoman, when you were going through the components of the case, one thing that you mentioned was that military element, the element that Jason Crow focused on in presenting the case to the Senate. So this component is one that is very closely linked to current events, because we now truly appreciate how important the security aid that the United States was giving to Ukraine is to Ukraine's independence and its ability to defend itself against attacks from Russia. So can you tell us a little bit more about what was in that package of military aid that the U.S. government tried to freeze in an effort to extort Zelensky for political favors? Tell us more about that aid and what was in it and why it was important to the Ukrainians.
I didn't know at the time what a javelin was, and it's so close to the word in Spanish jabalina, and I know what that is. And it's sort of like a wild pig. And, and I knew that's not what they were asking for, obviously. I mean, I'm a country girl. I mean, I grew up poor, and, we'd go out and shoot javelinas because we mixed it with pork to make tamales. And that's not what they were talking about. But, it was part of the package, and it was a great number that they needed. In fact, we've given them a lot of that and so much more in humanitarian aid, economic aid, and military aid in this last couple of packages that we have voted on. Jason Crow just had a really, really great way of presenting that and presenting it with such authority, because, he was an Army Ranger. He was out there. He served. He knows. And so when Jason Crow spoke about those things, we all listened because he was our expert. And I think the tragedy is that even though the former twice impeached president knew how desperately Ukraine needed that, he just didn't do it. I mean, here's this one guy who didn't want to give them the military weapons and defense weapons that they needed. And now here we roll forward, 2 years later, And that's what they really need to defend themselves now. And then you remember the Mueller report and all the things about misinformation and how the Russians were really out there trying to help Donald Trump get elected. And it was clear to everybody that Putin wanted the twice impeached former president to win. Now you kind of wonder, well, maybe he wanted him to win because it would have been easier for him. Because Trump would have never been able to get an alliance of all of our NATO allies and the European Union and everyone to come on board to help us on this issue. I mean, I cannot imagine Trump being able to accomplish what Joe Biden has been able to accomplish in putting such a strong coalition together in fighting Putin.
Some of you on this committee appear to believe that Russia and its security services did not conduct a campaign against our country, and that perhaps, somehow, for some reason, Ukraine did. This is a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves. The unfortunate truth is that Russia was the foreign power that systematically attacked our democratic institutions in 2016. In the course of this investigation, I would ask that you please not promote politically driven falsehoods that so clearly advance Russian interests. As Republicans and Democrats have agreed for decades, Ukraine is a valued partner of the United States, and it plays an important role in our national security. And as I told the committee last month, I refuse to be part of an effort to legitimise an alternate narrative that the Ukrainian government is a US adversary and that Ukraine, not Russia, attacked us in 2016. These fictions are harmful even if they're deployed for purely domestic political purposes. When we are consumed by partisan rancour, we cannot combat these external forces as they seek to divide us against each other, degrade our institutions, and destroy the faith of the American people in our democracy.
So, Congresswoman, you're describing Trump's attitudes about Ukraine. And a lot of this was influenced by the people that he associated with. He hired Paul Manafort as his campaign manager, who was later convicted for crimes related to Ukraine, kleptocracy. He listened to Rudy Giuliani, who was working with two gentlemen who have now been convicted of crimes related to Ukraine and Russian money that they were smuggling into U.S. politics. Could you talk a little bit about the people that Trump associated with and what they were doing in Ukraine and how this was influencing American policy and the American government's attitudes about that country?
Well, again, this is almost, outside of my realm of jurisdiction in terms of committees that I serve on now. And it's, when I was going through the impeachment trial, I was just focused on the Mueller report. I was focused on the phone call, and I was focused on the things in front of me. But now, as I reflect back and seeing what is going on, it just really, really makes you think twice about what Trump and remember, Giuliani was over there early on. I mean, Giuliani was almost given the responsibility for going over there and making sure that they fired the ambassador because she was in their way. They didn't want her there. They weren't very, diplomatic about getting rid of a diplomat. So I think it was all part of their scheme. And I'm wondering if some of this was Trump just doing what Putin wanted him to do. And, there's been a lot of speculation and I don't know if we'll ever, get the whole story. All I can tell you is my personal opinion because that's all it is. But I think that what happened in Ukraine with that phone call and what was all part of what I would consider the bidding that the twice impeached former president was doing in behalf of Putin and against the interests of our country.
So, Congresswoman, we've seen that with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, certainly attitudes across America have hardened against Vladimir Putin in favor of Volodymyr Zelensky. There's like this kind of Putin wing of the GOP, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Madison Cawthorn. They are definitely in their own corner with the white nationalists and the other people that they support and support them. But the mainstream GOP has also very, very much so hardened against Russia. So I'm wondering, considering the current context, in your discussions with your GOP colleagues, are any of them reconsidering how they view Trump's actions during that first impeachment? And do you think if there were theoretically this trial were to have happened under a similar context to what we're experiencing now, that maybe some of them would have voted to go ahead and impeach Trump?
No, I think they're looking at the current situation just for its current situation. None of that is really, spilling over to any other issue or any other vote. I don't see that. And, for example, I mean, the bipartisanship that you see on this and almost anything related to Ukraine, it doesn't spill over to anything else. It's very narrow. And if you look at what they're doing with what I call the effects of the war, the higher gas prices, the higher, food prices, all that is so directly related to the war. And quite frankly, we're going to have probably, higher food shortages than we even have gas shortages because, Putin is just not letting any grain or any of the seeds and things that they export anywhere. So there's going to be a huge food shortage. Probably my guess is in the last 2 or 3 months, first in Europe and in Africa and across the pond, if you will. But it's eventually going to hit us even harder. But they're not blaming Putin; they're blaming Biden. They'll at the end when they talk about the war, they talk against Putin, but never really for Biden and for his leadership on the war, and more importantly, his leadership in keeping that allies together. Never have we seen so many allies come together and develop a consensus on almost every single move. They keep talking about, we need the fly zone, sealed. We can't do that alone. We got to make sure that we work with our allies and we do the right thing for everybody. But there are some hardliners in the GOP who think we should have already done it. Some of them think we should have already sent them all the planes that they want, whether or not it will escalate the war and put us in a horrible situation with China and Russia. So it doesn't spill over. And they're hardliners, and they join us on just the war itself and sending them the equipment and the humanitarian aid. And I'm going to tell you this. I'm real concerned about whether we're going to be able to hold everyone together when it comes to humanitarian aid and dealing with the millions and millions of people that are being displaced. I think the number now is 4 million. I mean, and 90% of the people displaced are women and children. There will be refugees in Poland, but there will also be refugees all over the world. Will we be able to hold, our allies together to make sure that we provide the care, the work, the education, the healthcare, the housing for all these refugees that are being displaced that they don't know if they'll ever go back to their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, their cousins. And I know that I ask the question every time I can, are we going to be able to pledge the same amount of money that we're spending on the arms side and the weapon side on the humanitarian side? Because we have to take care of all those displaced people. And there's going to come a time that, it may be polar. Remember what's happened with other refugees. After a while, somebody says, no, all I want is 100,000. And another country will say, no, all I can take is so much. We cannot do that. Just as we're together to help them defend themselves, we're going to have to stick together to make sure that they can feed themselves, house themselves, and be productive in a new country, no matter which country they choose to go to.
We're going to go to the audience. So we're going to start with Shanette. Shanette, over to you.
Thanks so much. I know you talked about the fact that the Republicans have not given credit to Joe Biden for building, for his role in helping strengthen NATO and putting together a coalition in support of Ukraine. But I'm wondering if once this conflict is over and we've moved on and we get to hopefully by 2024, Ukraine is not still a war zone. But I'm wondering if what looks like Trump as the sort of, certainly all polling suggests that he's the leader of any kind of nomination if he were to want to run for election again. How do you think the Republicans will reconcile the need for supporting Donald Trump in 2024, given his support of Putin during this conflict?
Well, I'm going to be brutally honest with you, and this is, again, just my own personal opinion. I don't think it's going to bother them at all. I mean, just look at what's going on with the January 6th commission. They didn't want the commission. They're still in denial that anything really happened in terms of the insurrection. They have forgiven him for all that. They forgive him for everything because I frankly have never seen so many grown men afraid of one grown man. He just seems to be able to survive all this. And I don't think it's going to matter to them if that's going to be their nominee. And most of them support him. They seek his endorsement. They made the pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago to try to get his endorsement, his backing, his money, his supporters. So I think that's going to continue on. And if he ends up being the nominee, they're going to forget the insurrection. They're going to forget both impeachment trials. They're going to forget him calling Putin, a genius. They're going to forget all of this and just go with him again, just like they did the first time.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeanette. We are going to go next to Ab.
Essentially, I'm trying to ask, given the amount of, I guess we can say, open corruption that we saw during the Trump administration regarding, things, the violations of the Hatch Act and emoluments and so on and so forth, and knowing that our institutions are pretty much just run not necessarily on an actual, or essentially run on good faith, right? And there's not really anything there to prevent a president or administration from doing anything so long as he has the backing of a political party to essentially ignore and deflect. Are there conversations or legislation being drawn up to essentially create a more stronger reinforcement of our institutions? Or is this something that's just going to kind of just stay as it is and just remain based on goodwill?
Well, I can tell you that, I was totally frustrated sometimes, especially as a member of the Judiciary Committee, that I just felt like, there was not much that we could do. And even though we did pass, some bills, particularly the one that comes to mind is our House Bill 1 that dealt with, reforming the election process to try to build up the integrity of our elections, to do away with dark money, to do away with, some of the conflicts of interest that happen. And then it just sits and dies in the Senate. Remember, in this business, it really does take two to tango. We've got to have the Senate and agree with the Congress or not, at least present a bill that we can conference on and negotiate and do. But we just were not able, especially with McConnell's leadership, able to get anything passed in any reform or anything that we wanted to do. It's totally frustrating, and it still is, on voting rights, on civil rights, and a number of other issues, because even though it's 50-50, we can't get past the Senate. So, all I can say to you, it's a work in progress, and we have to keep fighting and doing what we can, because it is about protecting our democracy. It's about protecting the oath that each one of us takes. And it's about making sure that we have, I always say that democracy is a gift that we give from one generation to the next. And if we're not careful, this political party called the Republican Party, that appears to be more of a cult these days, is going to continue about the business of changing that to the degree that if another insurrection occurs and they succeed in any way, it will destroy our democracy. And I think that if we don't do enough to stop it now, it may happen in my lifetime, and that just makes me want to work harder and harder every day.
Yeah, we had David Gergen on, and he was very concerned about, some legal overthrowing of the Electoral College being what leads to the next coup.
It's the way they have battered and bruised and heckled and threatened election officials in so many states, because they know it all starts there is with the states and the state legislatures that make the voting laws. I mean, I saw that in Texas. I mean, they succeeded in suppressing so many votes. In my own county, there was at least, I think it was like 15,000 votes that were cast that just weren't counted because the paperwork wasn't filled right, because they changed it all. And they're doing that bit by bit in so many different states that are critical. They're fighting every way and every angle.
What is your outlook of the institutions of American democracy? And are they strong enough to withstand a potential second or third assault on them from somebody like Trump or Trump himself?
I think we're on the cusp of really continuing to being at risk. And right now, I number one, I totally support the nomination of our Supreme Court nominee. I think she was an excellent choice. I think she will be confirmed. But I do have a concern right now as to where the court is going and the reputation and the trust of the court, especially in light of some of the revelations about Justice Thomas and his conflict of interest and failure to recuse himself on some issues that maybe he should have. And the bottom line is this. I've told you all, I came from a lower jurisdiction court, but I had a canon of ethics. I had rules that I had to follow that were prescribed by the state, by my city, and then the canon of ethics for judges. That's one of the reasons I stopped being a judge, because I felt muzzled. There was too many rules of things that you could or could not do to avoid the appearance of impropriety, to avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest, to avoid any question of your integrity, of looking at everything based on the law and the facts and not be persuaded by any outside element. But yet here we hear of a Supreme Court justice whose wife is so close to him and represents, on a consulting basis, some groups that have briefs and do work within the Supreme Court, that she exchanged text messages with the chief of staff on the day of the insurrection. Yet he's heard cases about the insurrection. Those are really serious concerns. And I'm certainly a proponent of a judge is a judge. And if one judge is going to have to abide by some canons of ethics, I think all of them should. And I think our Supreme Court is going to have to really take stock and do a better job of policing itself, because that's what we're expecting them to do. And I'm not sure that they're doing it if you look at some of the things around this questionable behavior in terms of the Thomases. And secondly, we got to be ready in case there is another insurrection, that we can really, really make sure that we can defend ourselves and do what we have to do. I mean, I was there on the floor. I got, evacuated, and I stayed till the very end and didn't leave the floor till about 4:30 in the morning the next day, because I wanted to make sure that the process worked, and it worked this time. But anything could happen that would keep it from working next time. We could next time have a vice president who listened to those lawyers under the Trump administration that said, oh, no, you can do this. And yes, you can refuse to certify. You can delay it for 2 weeks and do an audit. All of those things could happen again. So we have to be ready. And the only way we can be ready is by electing people who take an oath of office, understand it, and always put that first. It's about making sure that you always put the interests of the country first, and that we are there to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States, and that we're there to make sure that we protect our democracy. It's the gift that we keep for our children and our grandchildren. So that's what I would tell you. It's on the cusp. We've got to do more to protect our democracy.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Congresswoman Garcia, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with real audience questions. For information on how to join us in past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode this Wednesday featuring Congressman Tony Gonzalez, who's also from Texas, about the U.S. immigration system. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team. Thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.